They said he looked to heaven and saw something looking back when Father Delacroix stopped the Mass. He didn't speak, he only walked to the doors, locked them from the outside, and by dawn, the church was ash and bone, the road to St. Ace. Armand weans through the French countryside like a fading scar. Stone walls crumble along the edges. The trees lean inward as though whispering to each other, their branches scraping against one another in the morning wind. The village itself feels almost empty, a scattering of houses, shutters closed even in daylight. The fields around it have long been left to rot. The only sound is the church bell, its tone thin and hollow, as though rung not for the living, but to remind the earth that someone is still here. And at the center, St. Armand's Church, a slate-roofed building, its limestone walls scarred with moss, its wooden doors worn soft from years of hands pushing them open. The steeple leans ever so slightly, a quiet bow toward the surrounding hills. Yet inside, candles are still lit. Someone is still praying. Father Delacroix arrived on a cold morning. In late autumn, his breath hung heavy in the air as he stepped down from the carriage, his boots sinking into the wet soil of the churchyard. He was a man in his early 40s, his black cassock still crisp, his collar immaculate. He had been sent by the diocese to serve this dying parish, one that no younger priest would take. Didn't yet know why the congregation, what little of it remained, met him with soft, weary smiles. Old women in shawls, a farmer and his wife, who still walked 6 miles each Sunday, 2 children, both cousins, who kept their eyes on the floor. During Mass, they sat scattered across the pews, as though reluctant to sit too close to one another, and yet they were devout every Sunday. They knelt, they crossed themselves slowly, lips moving in silent prayer. The hymns, though thin, echoed through the nave in a way that felt older than the church itself. But something wasn't right. Delacroix noticed it on his first evening when he entered the rectory office. The room was colder than the hall. Even with a fire-lit dust hung in the air like a faint haze, disturbed only when he opened the drawers. Inside were bundles of paper-yellowed, frayed, at the edges old parish records, tied with black ribbon, and beneath them, a separate stack, confessions, written ones, not the usual notes of forgiveness or penance. These were pages of cramped, uneven script, some nearly illegible, as though written in haste, each marked only by a date and a single initial. He read the first one aloud, softly, as though the walls might hear. It spoke of footsteps in the church at night, a voice behind the altar, a shadow in the apse that would not move, even when the candles burned bright. Another described hearing prayers in the crypt beneath the floor long after everyone had gone home. Delacroix set the papers down. His hands trembled, though the room was warm now. The next day, he asked one of the parishioners, an elderly woman named Marguerite, if she knew who had written them. She only looked at him for a long, silent moment. Then she shook her head and walked away without another word. That night, Delacroix stayed awake longer than usual, reading by candlelight in the rectory. The wind rattled the shutters. From the church nave beyond his door, the wood of the pews groaned like something settling or shifting, and that's when he heard out a single knock from somewhere below the floor. He froze, the flame of the candle shaking. It didn't come again. The church settled back into silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. The next morning, he opened more of the records. Each was older than the last. Some dated back nearly a century. But what struck him most wasn't the handwriting. It was the ink. The oldest ones, though faded, all ended the same way. A single line scrawled beneath every confession. Pray for St. Armand. No signature, no absolution. Just the plea by the end of that week. Delacroix had stopped sleeping in the rectory. He moved into the small upstairs room of the bell tower, claiming he preferred the view of the hills. But at night, when the wind shifted, he could still hear the creak of the pews far below. And sometimes, something softer like the faint whisper of voices rising from the crypt. The parishioners never spoke of it. They still came, still knelt, still prayed with unwavering devotion. but their eyes avoided his whenever the final hymn faded, as though they were waiting for him to leave first. And yet, he stayed each day. Father Delacroix found himself drawn back to the stack of papers. He would sit at his desk, the window open to the gray countryside, and trace his fingers over the ink, over the initials of people long dead, over the words written by hands that must have trembled just as his did now one night. He found a confession written in a language he did not recognize. The letters were sharp, angular, unlike any French script he had seen. The date was smeared. The paper smelled faintly of mildew, as though it had been kept somewhere damp for years. Before being filed away, he folded it, placed it back beneath the others, and as he did, he realized something. There were more pages now than when he first opened the drawer. The bundle was thicker, and yet he hadn't written a word. Father Delacroix looked toward the church door, the candle casting his shadow long across the wooden floor. Outside, the wind howled through the fields, rattling the panes. The bell in the tower groaned once, as if something had shifted its weight. He didn't move for a long time. The candle burned low. The paper sat silent in the drawer, but the church itself did not feel empty anymore. The camera drifts through the narrow hallways of St. Armand's Church. The air is still. The walls are lined with chipped plaster, their faint cracks forming crooked veins that run toward the arched ceilings. A single window at the far end filters in the last of the afternoon light, a dull gray glow that stains the wooden floor beyond the corridor. The nave waits in silence. The pews, worn thin by decades of hands gripping and knees pressing, form two uneven rows leading toward the altar. It is here, every Thursday evening, that the sisters gather to rehearse. There are 7 of them, women in plain habits, their faces lined by both age and routine, who stand shoulder to shoulder beneath the high rafters. The choir director, Sister Jean, keeps a notebook clutched against her chest, the edges of the pages bent and frayed that night. She brings something new, a sheaf of music ink faded, script unfamiliar, the notes written not in the rounded hand they were used to, but sharp, angular marks, curling into one another like roots twisting through soil. No name on the cover, no date. She places it on the wooden stand. The sisters gather closer. None of them can read the words scrawled beneath the staves. Yet, when Jean hums the first line, the others join without hesitation. The melody flows out, perfectly in tune, as though they had sung it for years. But none of them remember learning it. The hymn rises through the nave, slow and mournful. The sound clings to the cold air, each note hanging longer than it should. As though reluctant to fall, the candles flicker in the draft from the rafters. The wooden beams groan softly when the song ends. There is a long pause. The sisters stand in silence, their faces pale. Jean looks down at the page, her fingers tightening against the paper. She whispers to the group that she doesn't know where she found it. The others nod. None of them ask the next rehearsal. Another hymn appears. This one, too, bears the same alien script. The letters seem to shift slightly under the candlelight, the ink glistening like it has not yet dried. The melody, once again, is instinctive. Each sister mouths the strange syllables, their voices weaving together into a harmony so soft it barely reaches the far corners of the nave. But something wasn't right one evening. Father Delacroix, passing by the open doors, stops to listen. He watches as the sisters sing, their faces serene, their eyes half closed as though lost in prayer. Yet he notices their hands. Each one grips the hymn book tighter than necessary, their knuckles pale. The sound, though gentle, carries a faint tremor, as if it were not fully their own. After rehearsal, he asks Sister Jean where these hymns came from. She avoids his eyes, saying only that they've been part of their choir for as long as she can remember. But her voice falters, and when he presses, she admits she cannot recall ever learning them that night. Long after the sisters have gone, Delacroix lingers in the nave. The last candles burn low. He stacks the hymnals on the pew, closes the doors, and begins his slow walk back to the rectory. That's when he hears it, the melody faint rising from the church behind him. He turns, but the doors are shut. Through the cracks, no light escapes, the sound is muffled, almost imagined, yet unmistakable. The same hymn the sisters had sung just hours earlier. He stands there for a long moment, his breath visible in the cold. The notes drift lower, softer, before fading altogether. When he pushes the doors open, the nave is empty. The hymnals rest exactly where he left them. The next day, Jean tells him she woke in the night to the same sound, a whisper of voices, rising through the floorboards of her cell. She thought at first it was a dream, until she found her feet on the cold stone floor, the door of her room ajar. As though she had risen to follow it over the next week, more hymns appear, always in the same script, always unmarked. The sisters no longer question their origin, they simply sing, their voices blending into melodies that echo strangely off the walls. The sound carries farther than it should, reaching even the fields beyond. The village, some of the parishioners, walking the path after dusk, swear they hear it drifting through the trees. But when they enter the church to listen closer, there is only silence. Delacroix begins collecting the pages after each rehearsal, keeping them in his locked desk. Yet no matter how many he secures, more appear the next day, folded neatly on the stand, the ink always fresh, the paper cold too. The touchy starts to notice the sisters' behavior changing. Their conversations grow shorter, their meals quieter. They begin to hum the melodies under their breath, even outside of rehearsal. Their voices low and rhythmic, like a prayer, spoken without thought. One evening, he sees Sister Margot standing alone in the nave. Hours after Vespers, she is humming to herself, her fingers tracing the grooves of the pew, as though following a path only she can feel when he calls her name. She startles, her eyes glassy, unfocused. She claims she was simply praying, but when she walks past him, he notices her lips are still moving, still shaping the unfamiliar syllables of the hymn. By the second month, the sisters no longer wait for Jean to bring music. They arrive already knowing the next melody, their voices rising in perfect unison, as if rehearsed in dreams. Delacroix watches from the back, his hands clasped, the unease building in his chest. He begins waking in the night to the sound of their singing, not loud, just soft, drifting through the floorboards like a memory carried by the wind. Each time he descends the stairs to investigate, the sound fades before he reaches the nave. The candles are unlit, the air heavy, still, smelling faintly of cold wax and old wood. And then one night, it changes. The hymn does not fade. It grows louder. Delacroix, barefoot, steps into the corridor, the boards creaking beneath his feet. The sound is no longer a whisper. It is rising, the voices layered, the harmonies swelling with unnatural precision. He pushes open the nave doors. No one is there. The hymn continues, reverberating off the stone walls, vibrating through the air, as though the church itself is singing. The notes curl and twist, unfamiliar syllables pronounced by no mouth, yet filling every corner of the space. He grips the edge of the door, his breath shallow. The sound reaches a pitch so high, it feels like the walls might crack. Then silence. The nave plunges into stillness. The only sound, his own heart pounding in his chest. The cold seeps up through the soles of his feet. In the center aisle, where the sisters usually stand, lies a single page, the same script, the same ink, but this time, no notes, only words. He cannot read them, yet as he stares, his lips begin to move, forming the first syllable. Before he even realizes he is speaking, he drops the page. It lands softly on the wood, and for the first time since arriving at St. Armand, Delacroix feels something that no prayer can quiet, the sense that the church is beginning to remember things he cannot. The confessional at St. Armand sits in the far corner of the nave. Its oak frame is darkened by years of polish and candle soot, the edges rounded smooth by the passage of hands and knees. The small door creaks each time it opens, its hinges protesting softly, as though the wood itself resents being disturbed. Most evenings, Father Delacroix sits inside. The air within is close, almost stale, holding the faint scent of old varnish and the wax of countless candles. The lattice between priest and penitent feels thinner here, as though any sound might carry too easily through the walls at first. Nothing seemed unusual. The parishioners came, one by one, as they always had. They knelt. They whispered their sins in low voices, often trembling, their words lingering like shadows before Delacroix's quiet absolution. But by the second week of Lent, something changed. They began stepping inside and leaving without a word. The first was a man named Claude, farmer with heavy boots and hands worn rough from the fields. He entered just after dusk, the nave dim, except for the candles along the altar. Delacroix heard him settle to his knees, heard the wooden booth creak under his weight. Then nothing. The silence stretched. Claude's breathing grew quicker, sharper, and before Delacroix could speak, the door swung open. A man stumbled into the aisle, his face pale, his hands trembling as though he had been caught in a frost. He didn't look back by the end of that week. It was all of them Marguerite, the woman who never missed a single service, who whispered prayers over every candle she lit, stepped into the booth only to emerge moments later, her lips tight, her eyes wide. The two children, brought by their aunt, refused to kneel at all, clutching her sleeves until she led them away. No one spoke of it. They simply left, their footsteps echoing too loudly against the stone floor. But something wasn't right on a cold morning after the last parishioner had gone. Delacroix remained in the nave. The sunlight filtered through the high windows in dull gray shafts, illuminating the dust that swirled gently in the still air. He approached the confessional. The door felt heavier than usual as he opened it, the hinges releasing a long, tired groan inside. The wood seemed darker than before, the grain of the panels lost beneath deep shadows. He knelt in the priest's seat first, then leaned toward the lattice, listening. Nothing, only the faint hum of the wind pushing against the stone walls outside. Then he stepped into the penitent's side. The air there was colder. The bench, though smooth from years of use, felt damp beneath his fingers, as though it had absorbed the chill of the stones beneath the floor. He ran his hand along the wall beside him. The wood was rough in places, splintered when his fingers reached the lower panel. He stopped. There were marks, not the shallow, careless scratches left by boots or rings, but deep, deliberate grooves, long, uneven lines that cut through the finish, down into the pale wood beneath. Crouched lower, tracing the patterns with his fingertips, they clustered near the base of the wall, just above the floor, and they all pointed the same direction, upward, as though someone had been clawing to get out. Not in. Delacroix drew his hand back, the splinters catching briefly against his skin. He sat there for a moment in the dim light, his breath visible in the cold air, and that's when he heard a faint sound, not from the nave, from inside the confessional itself. It was a soft scrape, like wood shifting under pressure. He pressed his ear to the panel, holding his breath. Sound came again, slower this time, as though something dragged across the floor behind the wall. He pushed open the door, stepping back into the nave. The air outside felt warmer, cleaner, as if the confessional had been holding something stagnant within that night. He kept the booth locked. He told no one, but the parishioners noticed the next evening. They lingered at the back of the nave, glancing toward the confessional, as though expecting it to open on its own. Marguerite whispered to another woman that she could still hear breathing from behind its door. Even as they prayed at the altar, Delacroix tried to dismiss it, but the following morning he found something new. More scratches, fresh ones, near the latch inside the penitent's compartment. The wood there was raw, the shavings still clinging to the floor, and next to them, a splinter wedged into the lattice, stained a deep, dark brown. He told himself it was nothing old, wood breaking apart after years of neglect. But when he closed his eyes that night, the image remained, the grooves, the stains, the faint sound of the booth creaking, as though something still shifted inside, waiting for someone to kneel. By the end of that week, no one approached the confessional. The parishioners prayed in the pews, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward the corner where the booth sat. The shadows there seemed heavier, thicker, as though the candlelight dimmed each time it touched the wood. Delacroix began moving the booth open each morning, letting the cold air sweep Through he would press his hand to the scratches, feeling the rough grooves beneath his fingertips. They seemed deeper each day. Though he never heard a tool or hand at work one evening, as he prepared to leave, he heard a sound behind him. A single click. The confessional door had swung open, just slightly. Though he had locked it hours before, the air from within seeped into the nave. Colder than the night outside, he stood there for a long moment, staring at the narrow gap, the silence stretching around him like a held breath. Then, from inside, came another sound. 3 soft knocks, evenly spaced from the penitent's side. Delacroix backed away, the hairs on his neck rising. The nave felt suddenly smaller, the air tighter, as though the walls themselves had crept closer. He turned and left without locking the booth again that night. Lying awake in the bell tower, he could still hear it, not the knocks, not the creak of the hinges, just the faint sound of someone inside, breathing slowly, as though waiting for the next confessor to arrive. The candles of St. Armand's Church burn lower in the evenings. Their light flickers along the cracked stone walls, casting thin shadows that sway like slow-moving figures. Against the nave, the air is heavy with the smell of melted wax and cold limestone, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of habits as the sisters take their seats for Mass most nights. The pews remain nearly empty. The congregation, dwindled to a handful of villagers, sit scattered, their prayers murmured softly into the stillness. The only sound beyond the prayers is the creak of wood as each person kneels, rises, kneels again. But one evening, a new sound came. It was not the creak of a pew, not the shuffle of boots on stone. It was simply stillness. Delacroix noticed it first. From the altar, he looked out at the scattered faces, their eyes downcast, their lips moving silently as the last hymn began. And there, just beyond the aisle, sat a figure in the second pew-cloaked head, bowed unmoving. The hood concealed its face, casting the features in complete shadow. Despite the glow of the candles, no one had seen it enter. There had been no sound of the door opening, no gust of cold air, as the winter wind usually brought, but it was there. Still silent, the Mass continued. Delacroix's voice trembled slightly as he read the final prayers, his eyes drifting again and again toward the figure. It never moved, never shifted. When the service ended, the parishioners left quickly. The sisters lingered, their movements more careful than usual, glancing only briefly toward the second pew, before lowering their eyes. By the time Delacroix turned back to the nave, the figure was gone. The next evening, it returned. No one saw it arrive, no one saw it leave. But when the sisters filed into the church, it was already seated again, second pew, nearest the aisle. The hood remained drawn, the shape of a face barely visible within. Marguerite, the eldest of the parishioners, swore to Delacroix afterward that she had seen no feet beneath the cloak. But the hems, though long, did not touch the floor at all. He dismissed it aloud, but when he walked past the pew later that night, the wood was cold, much colder than the surrounding benches. As something wasn't right, the sisters stopped looking at it altogether. By the third evening, they entered with their eyes lowered, crossing themselves only once before taking their seats. Their voices during the hymns grew faint, uncertain, as though each note might draw the figure's attention. After Compline, Sister Jean approached Delacroix in the sacristy. Her voice was low, strained, barely more than a whisper. She told him she had dreamed of the figure, that in her sleep she had stood in the nave, the candles all extinguished, and heard it breathing behind her when she turned. It was standing where she had been, kneeling closer than it had ever been during Mass. She woke gasping, the taste of iron on her tongue. The following night, 2 more sisters admitted the same dreams that began in silence and ended with the sound of the pews creaking. Though no one else was there, they begged Delacroix not to speak of it, fearing that even saying its name aloud might summon it closer. He tried to pray longer before each service. The figure still came. He tried to light every candle in the nave, filling the space with as much light as the church could hold. But the glow never seemed to reach the second pew. The shadows there were deeper, as if the wood itself absorbed the light. and that's when he heard it on the sixth evening. Just as the final hymn ended, Delacroix paused at the altar. The sisters had finished their prayers, their heads bowed. The villagers had begun to rise from their seats, and beneath the hush of movement came a sound, a faint scraping like stone on stone. From the direction of the second pew his gaze lifted. Searching, the figure was still there, head still bowed, the hood unmoving. Yet the sound continued, so soft it might have been imagined, vibrating through the wooden floor. The sisters moved faster than usual. To leave that night, Marguerite refused to step past the pew at all, choosing instead to circle to the far side of the aisle, her rosary clutched so tightly the beads left marks on her palm. The dreams worsened. Jean began waking in the middle of the night, the sound of a slow, rhythmic breathing filling her cell. She lit a candle, expecting to find another sister outside her door, only to see the corridor empty. The sound would fade only when she pressed her hands over her ears and whispered the old prayers aloud. Two of the younger sisters stopped sleeping entirely, choosing to sit together in the refectory through the night. The faint glow of the hearth, their only light. When asked why, they said nothing. They only avoided looking toward the nave by the second week. Even Delacroix felt it each evening. As he prepared the altar, he found himself glancing toward the second pew before the doors even opened. His hands shook as he arranged the chalice and paten, the weight of the silence pressing heavier with each passing night. And then, on the 12th evening, the pattern broke. The figure moved for the first time. During the middle of Mass, Delacroix saw its head turn, not fully, just slightly, enough to suggest it was listening more intently. Its hood shifted. The faint shape of a face visible within the movement was soundless. Every candle in the nave flickered at once. Delacroix froze mid-prayer, his voice faltering. The congregation, though sparse, seemed to hold its breath. Even the sisters, who had trained themselves to avoid looking, felt their gazes drawn toward the motion. And in that moment, one of the younger sisters dropped her hymnal. The sound echoed sharply through the silence. The figure's head tilted slowly, deliberately toward hers. She did not move. No one did. When Mass ended, the figure remained seated as everyone filed out. Delacroix was the last to leave, his eyes fixed on the dark shape in the pew. As he reached the doors, he turned back. The nave was empty. The cold lingered. That night, he woke to a sound outside his chamber in the bell tower. The faint, familiar creak of a pew. He sat up, the wind rattling the glass in the narrow window above his bed. His breathing slowed, each inhale heavy, deliberate. And then came another sound, not the creak this time, a soft knock 3 times on the wooden floor. Just outside his door. Delacroix didn't move. He didn't call out. He simply sat in the darkness, his hand clutching the edge of the blanket, listening to the silence settle back over the tower. But he knew, as he lay awake until dawn, that when evening came again, the second pew would not be empty. The bell tower of St. Armand groans in the wind at night. Its wooden beams shift and settle with slow, aching sounds, like an old body turning in its sleep below. The fields lie still, black under the pale glow of a thin moon. The village sleeps without candles in their windows, the only light burning in the church itself, where Father Delacroix cannot rest. He sits in the rectory office. Alone, the fire in the small hearth has nearly died, leaving the room in a dim, orange haze. On the desk before him lies a book, its leather cover bound in cracking straps, its edges eaten by time and damp. He shouldn't open it. It carries the old red seal of the diocese, the kind affixed to documents meant never to be broken, the kind left behind by priests who did not wish their successors to ask questions. But Delacroix has run out of other explanations. The sisters have stopped speaking to one another after Compline. The hymns keep appearing, cold and unmarked, no matter how many he locks away. And every evening, the figure in the second pew still sits silent, unmoving, though every eye can feel its weight. So, at midnight, he breaks the seal. The wax gives with a brittle snap, crumbling. Under his thumb, a sound so small still echoes in the hollow room, loud enough that he glances toward the shuttered windows as though someone outside might have heard it inside. The pages are thick, coarse, the ink, though faded, gleams faintly when it catches the firelight. The handwriting is uneven, its letters leaning, twisting, as though each line was written by a different hand entirely. At times, it is elegant, careful, almost calligraphic. In others, it slants, sharply, jagged, scrawled in a rush that tears the paper fibers beneath it. But something wasn't right as he turns each page. Delacroix notices the words seem to shift when his eyes drift. The letters don't move, not exactly. But when he looks again, certain phrases appear different, longer, shorter. The curves of the ink slightly altered, as if the page prefers to be read only once, in silence, without scrutiny. The first entries are lists, dates, names, each followed by brief notes in Latin descriptions of rites, no longer sanctioned, prayers considered too old, too close to something the Church prefers not to name, but deeper in the ledger. The entries change, the handwriting grows shakier, the language, though still Latin, bends around words Delacroix doesn't recognize. Some are longer than a line. Some look less like words than shapes, symbols formed from overlapping strokes, as if written in a hurry to capture something glimpsed only once. And then he finds the warning. The ink is darker here, fresher somehow, as though it was written far more recently than the rest. The lines press deep into the page, the letters trembling with force. The passage is repeated twice. The second time underlined, it speaks of a watcher, not a spirit, not a demon, but something. That comes when a congregation grows too faithful, when their prayers gather so tightly, so fervently, that the weight of them draws attention from something that should never look inside. Delacroix leans closer, the firelight catching the sweat along his brow. The handwriting grows frantic in the next lines, warning that the watcher does not move by its own will, that it is drawn, pulled by the rhythm of devotion itself, that the more the congregation kneels, sings and believes, the closer it comes, and the harder it is to notice until it is already among them. His eyes drift toward the shuttered windows again. The wind outside has quieted. The rectory feels too still, as if the air itself is holding its breath. He reads on the final entry is shorter. The hand that wrote it had pressed so hard, the nib cut through the paper, the ink bleeding into the next page. It warns that the watcher does not need to act. It only needs to be seen. That acknowledgement alone, one glance too long, one prayer interrupted by curiosity, is enough to invite something into the dreams of the faithful. And that's when he hears a soft, deliberate sound from the nave beyond the office wall. Not the creak of the old beams, not the moan of the wind, a footstep. He freezes, the fire behind him sputtering in the draft that now slips. Under the door, another footstep follows, slow, measured, echoing against the stone floor as though each step were taken with great care. He closes the ledger. The sound of the cover meeting the desk is louder than he means it to be. The footsteps stop. Delacroix waits, every muscle rigid, the shallow sound of his own breathing, the only thing moving in the room. His eyes drift toward the far corner, where the narrow corridor leads to the nave. The shadows there seem thicker than before, as though the dying fire cannot quite reach them. Minutes pass. No more steps, no sound at all, but the air has grown colder. He sets his hand on the ledger again. The cover is cold to the touch, colder than the air around it, as though the book itself has been left outside in the frost. When he draws his hand back, faint moisture clings to his fingers. The page he last read is open again, though he is certain he had closed it. And now, where the ink once warned of the watcher, there is more lines that were not there before, not letters, just a series of marks, sharp and deliberate, arranged in the rough outline of a seated figure. Second pew, nearest the aisle. Delacroix feels the heat drain from his face. His hand trembles as he shuts the book and locks it back in the drawer, snapping the latch closed with more force than necessary. But as he moves to stand, another sound rises from beyond the office, a low, hollow creak, the sound of a pew shifting, weight settling into eye. Does not open the door. He does not move toward the corridor. He sits back down, his hands. Clasped so tightly, his knuckles ache, staring at the fire as it gutters lower, the light thinning into nothing outside, the bell in the tower sways once. Though there is no wind, Delacroix does not sleep for the rest of the night. And when dawn finally bleeds through the frost-clouded windows, he finds the ledger sitting on the desk, again its cover open, and inside, on the first page, written in a hand he does not recognize. Just 5 words. It looked back at you. The village of St. Armand lies silent under a frozen sky. The fields are bare, stiff with frost, their edges blurred where the fog rolls in from the river above it all. The bell tower of the church stands dark against the pale moonlight. The cross at its peak leans slightly, its shadow stretching long and thin across the cemetery below. It is 3 in the morning when the bells begin to ring. The first toll cuts through the silence like a blade. Low, hollow, it carries across the empty village streets, through the shuttered windows, where the last candles have long earned out. Then a second toll, and a third, each one perfectly spaced, each one resonating deeper than the last. Father Delacroix wakes with a start. He is in the small chamber beneath the tower, where he is taken to sleeping. The cold has seeped through the stone walls, leaving the blankets damp against his skin. He sits up, listening. The bells continue, but something wasn't right. No one is in the tower. No one could Beatty's staircase to the belfry is locked each night, its iron latch sealed with a key he keeps in his own coat. He can see the key now, still hanging on the hook beside the door. The bells keep ringing, slow, steady, each strike vibrating through the floorboards. Up through his bones, Delacroix pulls on his coat, his breath visible in the frigid air, and moves into the corridor. The church beyond is dark, the only light spilling from the moon through the high windows, silvering the pews and casting the long aisle in a cold, thin glow. As he reaches the nave, the doors swing open, both of them together. The sound is soft, deliberate, as though someone is pushing from the inside with careful, measured force. The night air seeps in, sharper, colder, and with it comes the faint scent of wet earth from the fields. Delacroix stops in the center of the aisle, his breath clouding before him. The bells continue overhead, their rhythm unwavering, each toll sinking deeper into the silence that follows. And that's when he hears it, not the bells, something beneath them, faint rustle like fabric shifting from the pews. He turns his head. The benches, which had been empty moments ago, are not empty now. Shadows sit where the parishioners once knelt, dozens of them, dark and without detail, their forms barely holding shape against the dim light. Their heads are bowed, their hands folded in front of them, as if in prayer. Each one faces the altar. None of them move. Delacroix cannot hear them speak, but their mouths are moving slow, deliberate in unison. The sound does not reach his ears, but he feels it deep in his chest, like the low thrum of a distant organ, a vibration that rises with each movement of their lips, pulsing against his ribs in time with the tolling of the bells. The longer he stands there, the heavier it becomes, not just in his chest, but in his throat, as though the rhythm is pulling the air from his lungs, replacing it with something heavier, colder. He stumbles forward, gripping the back of a pew for balance. The wood feels frozen under his fingers, so cold it burns. His breath comes shorter, shallower, each inhale pulling in more of that silent weight, pressing from all sides. He looks toward the altar. The shadows do not follow his gaze. They remain fixed, kneeling, their mouths moving in perfect rhythm. Then, all at once, the bells stop. The silence that follows is worse. The pews creak softly as the shadows turn their heads, not toward the altar, now toward him one by one. Every bowed head lifts. Their faces are not faces, just the faint impression of where features should be, darker than the rest of their forms. But their mouths do not stop moving. The pressure in Delacroix's chest rises sharply, as if each silent word is carving out the space inside him. He grips the pew harder, his nails scraping the frozen wood. The doors at the back of the church slam shut. The sound reverberates through the nave, shaking the dust loose from the rafters. The cold air grows heavier still, settling over the room like a thick veil, and then the floor shifts. It is subtle at first, a tremor so light it could be mistaken for the wind against the tower, but Delacroix feels it through his boots. The faint, rhythmic vibration beneath the stone, matching the silent cadence of the shadow's lips. He backs toward the altar, each step slow, his eyes fixed on the rows of dark figures. None of them rise, none of them reach for him. They simply kneel, watching, mouthing words. He still cannot hear, but he can feel them, each one a weight against his chest, pressing deeper, slower, as though something unseen is testing how much space he can hold before breaking. He stumbles against the altar steps. The wood behind him feels warm, almost feverish compared to the air. He grips it, steadying himself, his breath ragged, shallow. Then the shadows stop moving their mouths. All at once, the pressure in his chest vanishes, so suddenly it leaves him gasping, clutching at his ribs. Nave is silent, completely still. Every figure turns its head slowly, together back toward the altar. Delacroix follows their gaze. And there, at the foot of the altar, is another shadow, taller than the rest, unmoving, its head slightly tilted upward, as if it is looking not at the cross, but beyond it, toward the belfry above. The bells toll again. Once the sound is sharper, now closer, as though it is coming from inside the church rather than the tower. The shadows bow their heads once more, their hands folding in perfect unison. Delacroix doesn't move, he doesn't speak, he only listens as the second toll comes, and the third, each one sinking lower, heavier, as though the church itself is drawing breath. The final note lingers far too long, vibrating through the wooden beams, the stone walls, the very air itself. It rattles the glass in the high windows, shakes loose the old wax from the candlesticks near the altar, and then silence again. The pews are empty. The nave is still. Only Delacroix remains, standing before the altar, the echo of that weight still pressing faintly against his ribs, as though something unseen has marked the space it intends to return to. When he finally turns, the doors of the church stand wide open once more, though he never heard them move outside. The bell rope sways gently in the windless air, and somewhere, high above, the iron clapper moves once, without striking, as if the tower itself is waiting for the next hand to pull it. Delacroix doesn't leave the church that night. He cannot, because every time he closes his eyes, he still feels it, that rhythm, soft, slow beating in his chest, like a voice waiting to speak through him. The morning of the 7th Sunday at St. Armand broke with a pale, bruised light. The frost clung to every blade of grass, and the fields beyond the village lay silent, a thin fog rolling low along the ground like breath held too long. Inside the church, the air was warmer, but close thick with the smell of melted wax and the faint musk of damp stone. The congregation came, as they always did, a handful of villagers, the sisters in their habits, their steps measured, their eyes lowered, and Father Delacroix moving slower than usual toward the altar, his hands tight around the missal. The candles had been lit before dawn. Their flames burned tall and still, throwing long shadows up the stone walls, each one swaying just slightly, as if to a rhythm none of them could hear. The Mass began. As it always had, the opening hymn rose softly, a low hum of voices filling the nave, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The words were familiar, though few sang with strength anymore. Their voices had grown subdued, as if any sound above a whisper might disturb something lingering in the rafters. First prayers were spoken. The congregation knelt. The air was still, but something wasn't right. Time did not move the way it should at first. There was no reason to notice Delacroix read from the gospel, his voice low, the cadence. Even the sisters bowed their heads in unison, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes fixed on the stone beneath their knees. The sun outside had begun to rise higher, its faint warmth filtering through the high windows, cutting lines of gold across the pews. Then, without warning, that light shifted, not gradually, as it should, abruptly. One moment, the sun was climbing the eastern sky. The next, it had sunk lower, shadows lengthening unnaturally fast across the floor. No one seemed to notice. No one moved. Congregation stayed kneeling, their bodies still, their faces slack, as if held in some quiet trance. The only sounds were the faint crackle of the candles and the creak of wood as the pews adjusted beneath the weight of those who still sat Delacroix's voice had gone silent. No one recalled when he stopped speaking. The sun slid further west. The light through the windows thinned, cooling, turning from gold to a pale blue-gray. The frost outside had begun to return, crawling up the glass from the edges inside. The candles did not burn down. Their flames stood just as tall, just as still, their wax unmelted despite the hours that passed. The nave remained bathed in that flickering light, untouched by the changing sky outside, and that's when he heard it, not a voice, not a bell, just the faint sound of breathing. Delacroix looked out over the bowed heads, the still shoulders, and realized it was not coming from any of them. It was coming from the walls. The stone itself seemed to exhale, a slow, deliberate rhythm that carried through the floor, up into the pews, vibrating faintly beneath the kneeling figures. Each inhale brought a subtle cold, seeping into their bones. Each exhale, a warmth that felt closer to fever than comfort still. No one moved. No one looked up. The sky outside darkened. A pale glow of dusk bled through the windows, staining the interior in a cold twilight hue. The candles still burned unchanged. The congregation still knelt. Hours had passed, though none of them felt it, not as hunger, not as stiffness in their limbs. When the first star appeared outside, Delacroix finally shifted. He rose from the altar. Steps, his knees stiff, his movements sluggish, as if he had been there for far longer than his body could comprehend. He looked at the faces before him, blank, peaceful, unmoving. Their lips did not move. Their eyes, when they blinked, did so slowly, as though remembering the action from a great distance. The doors at the back of the church creaked open. The sound echoed through the nave, sharp against the heavy quiet, but no wind followed, no figure entered. The air remained still, heavy with that same slow, rhythmic breath, as though the building itself were waiting for something. Delacroix took one step forward, his eyes locked on the open doors. The faintest trace of cold fog drifted along the floor from outside, curling around the feet of the pews, settling like a thin veil over the stone. The candles flickered only once, and then the doors closed. On their own, the sound was soft, deliberate, like two hands drawing them inward with perfect care. When Delacroix turned back, the congregation had not moved. Their eyes were still lowered, their bodies perfectly still, as though they had not heard the doors at all. He looked to the windows. The last traces of daylight had faded. The night sky, pressed against the glass, the stars sharp and cold, the moon casting a faint, silver glow over the frost on the panes inside. Nothing had changed. The candles still burned. The congregation still knelt. And then the bells began to ring softly, distantly, as though muffled by snow. The sound did not come from the tower, but from somewhere deeper, beneath the floor. Vibrating through the stone itself, each toll was low, drawn out, the space between them filled with that same steady, unnatural breathing that seemed to emanate from the walls. Delacroix tried to speak, his voice caught in his throat, the weight in his chest, familiar now, pressed harder, pulling his breath shallow, forcing him to remain still. Alongside the others, the bells continued, their sound stretching, warping, until each toll seemed to last longer than the last, as though time itself was bending around the rhythm. The candles did not flicker, the congregation did not move, and when the final bell faded into silence, the breathing stopped. The church was still perfectly silent. The only sound was Delacroix's own heart, pounding unevenly in his ears, each beat louder than the last in the vast quiet. He looked at the faces of the kneeling figures once more. Their eyes were closed now, every one of them, not bowed in prayer, closed, as if in sleep. The night outside deepened. The stars wheeled silently. Overhead, Delacroix did not remember how the Mass ended, nor when the congregation finally left. Only that, When the sun rose the next morning, he was still standing at the altar. The candles still burned, and not one soul in St. Armand could recall hearing him speak a single word, not during the readings, not during the prayers. Not at all yet. All of them had been there kneeling for what felt like no time at all. The nave of St. Armand glowed faintly, the air heavy with incense and the scent of melting wax outside. The sky was a flat gray, the fields still slick with frost, though the sun had already risen inside. The warmth felt wrong, stale, as if the walls themselves had trapped too many breaths that would not leave it. Was the evening mass. A smaller crowd than usual, though no one had stopped coming entirely. The sisters knelt near the front, their faces lowered, their lips moving silently in prayer. A few villagers filled the back rows, their shoulders hunched, their eyes fixed not on the altar, but on the floor. As though afraid to look too long at the ritual about to begin, Father Delacroix moved slowly, deliberately. His hands were steady as he placed the chalice upon the altar. A simple cup of silver, its edges worn smooth by years of use, polished until it caught the candlelight in pale flashes. He poured the wine carefully, its surface rippling once. As the liquid settled, the congregation's murmurs died away. The air grew still. The first prayers began, each word deliberate, the syllables echoing faintly off the vaulted ceiling. The candles lining the nave burned evenly, their flames small but unwavering, each one casting a perfect halo of light that pulled softly across the stone floor. Delacroix lifted the chalice. The weight was familiar, grounding in his hands, but something wasn't right. It began with a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible hum, too low to be a voice, too even to be the wind. It seemed to rise from the very stones beneath the altar, vibrating upward into his arms. The tremor so subtle, he might have thought it was his own pulse, if not for how steady it remained. The sisters lifted their heads, their eyes flicked, not to him, but to the chalice. The wine inside had begun to ripple again. No one had touched it. There was no draught, no movement of air, yet the surface shivered, concentric circles forming and breaking, faster and faster. Though the chalice itself did not shake in his grip, Delacroix tightened his hold. The hum grew louder, a pressure he felt more than heard, pressing against his chest, crawling up the back of his neck. The congregation shifted uneasily, a few of the villagers glancing toward the doors, as if expecting them to open. And that's when he heard a sharp, metallic crack from his hands. Chalice split. No one touched it, no force struck it. It simply broke, a jagged line tearing down its stem with a sound so clean it rang like a struck bell. The cup collapsed in two, the wine spilling out in a sudden rush, splattering across the altar and spilling over its edge. The liquid struck the cold stone floor with a sound louder than it should have made too loud, each drop echoing as if the church were hollow beneath them, amplifying every impact. The wine spread fast, seeping into the cracks between the flagstones, not pooling, not soaking, but flowing, with a strange purpose, like veins branching outward in all directions. Thin, dark lines winding their way down the central aisle beneath the pews. Toward the doors, the congregation didn't move. Not one person rose. Their eyes followed the lines as they spread, silent, their faces drained of color, their breathing shallow and uneven. The hum in the stones deepened, pulsing now in time with each vein of liquid as it stretched farther through the nave. Then, without warning, every candle went out all at once. Not a flicker, not a gust, as though a single, deliberate breath had swept through the entire church. The darkness was total. Delacroix could not see the congregation, only the faint glisten of the wine as it continued to spread, faintly reflective in what little moonlight slipped through the high windows. The air was colder now, damp, each breath condensing before him, though he could not see it clearly in the blackness. The hum stopped, replaced by silence, so heavy it rang in his ears. And then came the other sound, not from the pews, not from the doors, from the floor itself, a faint, wet movement, the sound of something shifting just beneath the stone, tracing the same paths as the wine above, as if the church itself or drawing something in through its cracks. Delacroix gripped the edge of the altar, his fingers numb against the freezing wood. His eyes darted toward the congregation, but he could only make out the faint outlines of their faces, pale against the dark, their eyes wide, unblinking. The wine's glisten slowed, the lines it had, carved along the floor, stopped spreading, settling in a web that now reached every corner of the nave. The silence deepened. No one breathed. Not the sisters, not the villagers, not even Delacroix. It was as if the air had been taken from the room entirely. The doors at the back of the church creaked, slowly, not opening, not closing, just moving, as though some hand pressed against them from the outside, testing their weight. The sound dragged on, groaning through the stillness, until finally it stopped. Delacroix's vision swam. The lack of air burned in his chest, each beat of his heart loud, frantic, desperate. He staggered forward, his hands trembling as he tried to speak, to command, to call the mass to order. But no sound came out. The candles flared, all of them. At once their flames roared to life, as if ignited by a single strike, burning taller, brighter, their heat searing against the skin. The sudden light revealed the congregation still kneeling, their faces pale, their mouths slightly open, as though caught mid-breath, their eyes fixed on the floor. Delacroix followed their gaze. The wine was gone, not absorbed, not dried, gone. The floor was dry, the cracks empty, as though nothing had ever spilled at all. The chalice lay in two perfect halves on the altar, its edges clean, unbent, no trace of the wine inside or around it. No one moved, no one spoke. The candles flickered once, their flames dipping low before steadying again. The warmth in the room felt heavier now, pressing against the chest rather than comforting it. Delacroix set his hand on the altar for balance. The wood beneath his palm pulsed, once slow, deliberate, like a single heartbeat. He drew his hand back quickly, his breath unsteady, his eyes darting around the nave. No one had noticed, or perhaps none of them dared to. The mass continued silently, each of them kneeling, waiting. As the air grew heavier still, the candlelight dimmer, the sound of that faint, wet shifting beneath the floor, lingering just at the edge of hearing. By the time the final prayer was spoken, none of them could say if the chalice had ever held wine at all. Only that, when the doors finally opened, the air outside felt wrong, as if something inside the church had stayed with them, just beneath their ribs, moving with the rhythm of their own breath, waiting. The church of St. Armand stood silent in the cold hours before dawn. The windows were dark, the fields beyond shrouded in mist, so dense that the trees at the edge of the cemetery seemed to float, their trunks erased by the fog inside. The air was colder still, though every candle from the night before had burned itself out to nothing. Father Delacroix had not slept. He hadn't in days. The weight in his chest, what he had felt during the bells, during the chalice, during each mass that stretched beyond reason, had not left. It pulsed there now, faint, deliberate, as though something beneath his ribs had learned to match his heart's rhythm. And in that rhythm, beneath it, he heard the sound whispers, not voices, not words he could understand, just the faint, deliberate cadence of something speaking far below the altar. He told himself it was the wind through the cracks in the foundation, the settling of the stones, the murmurs of his own fraying mind. But something wasn't right. The whispers were not constant. They came in waves, soft and measured, always beginning and ending in the exact same spot, directly beneath the altar. At first, he stood there listening, the cold seeping through the soles of his shoes, his breath fogging faintly in the still air. The whispers grew clearer the longer he listened, not louder, but closer, as though each one was climbing upward through the stone itself, waiting to be heard. And that's when he heard a sound beneath the whispers, a single, dull scrape metal against stone. Delacroix moved behind the altar, his fingers brushing against the carved wood, still faintly warm from the last mass. Though the church had sat empty, all night he crouched, tracing the base with his hand until he felt it, a line thin cold cut into the floor itself, seen hidden beneath the heavy rug where the priest stood during service, was a trapdoor, The iron ring was small, worn smooth, and so cold it burned his skin when he gripped it for a long time. He didn't pull, he only stood there, bent over, his breath shallow, his ears straining against the steady hum of the whispers below. Then, without deciding to, he lifted. Trapdoor opened with a sound like a long exhale, the stale air beneath rising up, thick with the scent of damp earth and something older, sweeter like wine left too long in a sealed cascade narrow staircase, descended into darkness. The stone steps were slick with moisture, their edges worn, each one uneven underfoot. The air grew heavier with every step, clinging to his skin, his lungs, his thoughts. The whispers did not grow louder, but they became clearer. Not words, not language, just a rhythmus. If something below was reciting a prayer it had never needed to understand at the bottom, the chamber opened wide. The ceiling was low, supported by beams that looked as though they had been cut from the very trees buried in the cemetery. Above the walls were rough-hewn stone, darkened with age, each surface scratched and scored with lines. Not random, deliberate prayers, dozens of them, in languages he could not name. Some etched deep as though gouged by tools. Others so faint they could have been made by nails dragged across the surface, layered atop each other, filling every inch of the stone. The air was colder here, but still he stepped further inside. The whispers had stopped. What replaced them was worse. Sound like settling weight, bone against bone. The chamber floor was not empty rows of skeletons sat in. Neat formation, their spines curved, their skulls bowed, each one arranged as though they were still listening to a sermon only they could hear. Some clutched fragments of rosaries, beads long since dulled by time. Others had hands folded neatly in their laps, their finger bones polished smooth by something he could not imagine. There were dozens, maybe more, each one facing the same point at the far wall. Delacroix turned his gaze there. Slowly, his breath uneven. The wall behind the altar was different from the others. The scratches there were deeper, thicker. One prayer repeated again and again, in every language he could recognize, and some he couldn't. The words carved so violently into the stone that flakes still littered the floor beneath. The same, "Plea avert the watcher," over and over, filling every inch. The scratches grew fresher toward the center, the cuts cleaner, as though someone or something had been adding to them long after the bones around him had been set in their final positions. Delacroix felt the weight in his chest pulse harder, matching the beat beneath his ribs until it nearly stole the breath from his lungs. He stumbled closer to the wall, his fingers brushing the deep grooves of the words. The stone felt warmer here, faintly, like the lingering heat of breath on cold glass, and then he felt it, not sound, not air movement behind the wall, a slow shift, like something vast rolling over in a deep sleep, pressing faintly against the stone from the other side. The bones in the rows behind him creaked, one by one, not shifting, not rising, but settling deeper, their joints popping softly in the stillness, as if adjusting their posture to better listen. Delacroix backed away from the wall, his steps unsteady, the chamber pressing in around him with a weight so heavy it felt like the air itself was turning. Solid, his breath came shallow, uneven, each inhale scraping the back of his throat like dust. The scratches seemed deeper, now the words sharper, and beneath them another sound, the faintest echo of a breath, drawn in from behind the stone. Slow, deep, it matched his own. He staggered to the base of the stairs, his hand gripping the damp stone for balance, his vision blurred at the edges, the rows of bones seeming to tilt and stretch as though the chamber itself was leaning in around him before he climbed. He looked back one last time. The chamber had grown darker. The candle he carried burned low, its flame trembling though no wind touched it. The shadows of the bones stretched long across the floor, all of them bending toward the wall as if pulled by something beyond it. And in that moment, he realized that the whispers hadn't stopped. They had only moved upward, through the stairs, toward the altar, toward the nave, where the congregation would gather come morning. Delacroix turned and climbed, each step heavier than the last as though the air below clung to him, dragging at his bones. His hand trembled on the trapdoor's iron ring as he pulled it closed above him. Church was silent, completely still, but the weight in his chest hadn't left it. Pulsed once, twice steady now, almost calm and in that steady rhythm. Father Delacroix knew whatever waited beneath the altar had already chosen, and by the time the sun rose, he would have to decide whether to serve it or burn the church to the ground. The sky above St. Armand was pale, almost colorless, the sun only a faint suggestion behind a heavy layer of morning fog. The fields were silent. The frost on the grass had not yet begun to thaw. The wind, when it moved, did so gently, carrying with it only the smell of damp earth and the faint smoke of distant hearths. But at the edge of the village, another smell drifted across the mist, one no one wanted to acknowledge. The church was burning. It began just before dawn, a faint glow behind the high stained glass windows, the kind of shimmer villagers at first thought was the reflection of an early sun. The first to see it stood at their doorsteps in silence, robes pulled tight around their shoulders, their breaths clouding in the cold. The glow grew orange, then red, but something wasn't right. The smoke rose, dark and heavy, curling above the steeple in slow, deliberate ribbons, and yet there was no sound, no crack of beams, no scream of timbers splitting, no shouts from within, only the faint, steady hiss of fire. The villagers gathered at a distance. Not one stepped closer than the worn path that led to the gates. Some clutched their rosaries, lips moving in prayers too soft to hear. Others stood with arms folded, their faces pale, eyes fixed on the flames dancing behind the windows. No one moved to fetch water. No one cried out for Father Delacroix. Not a single person spoke above a whisper, and that's when they heard it, not from within the church, not from the flames, from the ground. A low hum, deep and steady, rising from the soil beneath their feet. The same sound some swore they had felt during Mass in the weeks before. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even something they could properly hear. It was something they felt in their ribs, in the pit of their stomachs. The fire swelled, the windows shattered outward, spilling glass and embers into the frosted grass below. Still, there were no screams, no movement inside, only the steady collapse of the interior as the roof beams buckled and fell, one by one, each impact muffled, as though the air itself were swallowing the noise. The sisters stood together, their faces blank, their hands clasped, their eyes fixed on the flames. None of them wept, not one. The villagers watched as the steeple caught the highest point of the church flaring bright against the pale sky. The bell, once so steady in its call, gave a single dull note as its supports gave way, dropping into the inferno below without echo or resonance. The fire did not spread. The grass surrounding the church remained wet with frost, untouched by sparks. The cemetery, only yards away, lay in stillness, the mist clinging low between the yew stones. The church burned in silence, as though it were the only thing in the world capable of burning by the time the sun broke fully through the fog. The building was gone. The roof, the walls, the altar, every piece of wood, every trace of cloth, every book, every bench reduced to ash that smoldered faintly in the morning air. Only the stone steps at the entrance remained, cold, blackened, leading to nothing. The villagers did not approach until hours later. By then, the smoke had thinned, the ash settled. The air was heavy with a smell they knew but could not place. Not the sharpness of charred wood, not the acrid sting of burned cloth wine sweet lingering. The scent clung to the stones, to the frost, to their clothes as they stepped closer. It was not overpowering, but constant, as though a cask had been broken somewhere deep beneath the ruins and would never stop spilling its contents. Some knelt at the steps, pressing their hands to the stone. It was cold to the touch, but beneath that chill, faintly, there was something else, a thrum soft like a pulse. The sisters left first, walking in single file back toward the convent on the far hill. Not one of them looked back. Not one of them spoke. The villagers remained until nightfall, scattered along the road, their eyes fixed on the blackened ruin. Even as the fog rolled back in to claim it once more, one spoke of Father Delacroix. No one asked if he had escaped, and when the moon rose, pale and distant above the trees, those who still lingered swore they saw the ash stir faintly, as though drawn upward by some breath. They could not hear. The smell of wine did not fade, not that night, not the next, not in the weeks that followed even. When the frost thawed and the first shoots of spring grass broke through the soil around the thea. Ruins, the stones remained dark, the scent still there, and when the new priest arrived months later to bless what was left of the site, he found the stone steps faintly damp, not from rain, not from dew, but from something thicker red seeping slowly from a crack in the top step, tracing a thin line downward that never dried. The villagers told him not to touch it, not to wipe it away, not to bless it, because they all remembered the last time someone tried to erase a sign the church left behind, and what followed. How many churches have burned, not by accident, but by choice? When faith calls something else to listen, perhaps fire is the last prayer a priest can give, and somewhere, in another forgotten village, another mass is about to begin.